Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I'm writing to tell you about my Bigfoot encounter that happened to me about 5 years ago in the spring of 2015. It was 2 o'clock in the morning and my cell phone started to ring, and that always creeps me out. I get this horrible feeling when you get a call that early that I'm about to get some horrendous news. I was not wrong. My sister phoned to tell me that a very close friend of ours had just passed away suddenly. Her parents had found her an hour earlier, just lying there deceased. No one knew what caused her untimely demise. I knew for a fact that she had no pre-existing health conditions. To say I was devastated was an understatement, because this friend of mine was as good as a sister to me. I literally curled up into a heap on the floor and cried and cried. Finally, I got it together and called my friend Bella, who lives next door to me. I knew she would really understand the emotional turmoil I was going through. "Hello, is that you, Sandra?" I heard her say. "Why are you phoning so early? It's 4 in the morning, you know." "Brittany's dead," I told her. "I'm coming over now," she said. "I'll be there in a second. Keep it together." The next thing I knew, Bella was taking me into her arms and consoling me, and we both began to cry. "I know what," she said. "Let's go for a drive. We'll take a scenic route. I think the fresh air will do us the world of good, and the scenery will help give us some perspective." It seemed like a brilliant idea to me. It was still dark outside, but I could see the early glimmers of the sunrise. We drove a very scenic route, and we enjoyed the beautiful views. "I love those old redwood trees," sighed Bella. "Some of them are several human lifetimes old. Do you know they're the most resilient of trees because they can bounce back from any major damage? It is hard for them to die, you know." "I wish we could all be that resilient," I said. "I wish it was hard for us to die." "Oh, but we are resilient," said Bella. "As raw as you may be feeling now, you'll bounce back just like the redwood tree. It's only a matter of time. Time is the best healer, you know. You'll never forget Brittany, but the pain will lessen. I promise you it will." I started to cry again, and Bella pulled over to the side of the road to comfort me. "I know it's hard," she said. "I know it's really, really difficult when you love someone so much and you lose them. It's the worst feeling in the world. But I promise you, things will get better." "But why, oh why? Why did it have to be her of all people?" Just then we heard this huge roar. It sounded like a lion, but it was so much more scary than a lion's roar. And then it happened again. "Did you hear that?" said Bella, looking aghast. In a second, my tears had dried up and my attention was aroused. "What the heck was that?" I asked. We heard the roar again, and then we saw this large, dark form running from the tree line. As it was a fair distance away, we thought for a moment that it was a man. "What on earth is a guy doing in the woods at this time?" said Bella. "It's only 5:10, she said. "Who gets up this early?" Some people do, I said. Suddenly we saw the creature coming in our direction, and he moved like the wind, with a bounce to his movement. What the heck is that? Said Bella. It's way too large to be a man. The man-like being, or whatever he was, seemed to be chasing something small, keeping his eyes peeled to the ground like an owl hovering over its prey. As he did this, we ventured closer to see. We finally had a good view of him. Suddenly he pounced on the thing in the grass with lightning speed and seized it in his large hands. He pounded the bird, and squatting on the floor, he proceeded to tear away the feathers one by one, placing them in a neat pile next to him. He then ate the bird like it was a candy bar or a donut, bones and all. Bella and I looked on in utter astonishment, hardly believing what we were seeing with our naked eyes. Even the thought of Brittany's death was momentarily postponed, as we were transfixed and mesmerized by the creature before us. But what was he, we wondered? And then, at the same time, we both said it. It's a Bigfoot! The creature was bipedal, but I bet he could have run on all fours, because like a monkey, he had long arms that went way beyond his knees. His hands looked almost human. I noticed his body was covered with dense, dark brown hair that looked matted and disturbed by bits of foliage and bits of bark all caught up in it, and it was horrible, as if he'd been rolling around in the mud. The creature was about 7 foot tall when he stood erect, and he had a large chest that tapered down towards slender hips and long, lean, but very muscular thighs. I think the creature must have felt our stares, or just sensed us looking at him, because he looked up at us as he was eating. He appeared momentarily surprised, as if he had been caught off guard. While he continued to eat, he stared at us for a moment longer, with wide, curious brown eyes, and then he looked at us in a way that reminded me of an inquisitive monkey. His face definitely had a humanness to it, but he was not human. Yet I could sense he had a superior intelligence compared to other animals. Our gazes locked in a kind of hypnotic stare, and then the creature turned away, and in seconds he had gone, with his half-eaten bird still in his hands. Bella and I marvelled at what we had been so privileged to witness, and decided that we would venture in the woods the following day to see if we could see any signs that the creature may have left behind. In the woods we did find a nesting area strewn with bones and animal carcasses, and we did see some smaller tree snaps, but nothing else. We did not smell or hear anything. I did think my encounter with the Bigfoot helped in my grieving process, because I was not just dwelling on poor Brittany's death, but also on my Bigfoot sighting, which was so exciting for me. I was in awe of the creature, because although it was primitive in so many ways, it had a humanness to it that still intrigues me today. To cut a long story short, the autopsy revealed that Brittany had died from a brain aneurysm. So there you are. That was my Bigfoot encounter, one that I will never forget. And to this day, I treasure that memory. And I'm eager for another Bigfoot sighting. Hello, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so glad you've joined me this evening, and I've got a fabulous story for you, and you're really going to enjoy this. This is about the Kushtaka, and it's stepped out of cryptozoology. There have been so many encounters in Alaska with this creature that is otherwise known as Otterman. And if you're interested in Bigfoot, you're definitely going to be interested in the Kushtaka. And this is a story about that, and I think you're going to find it absolutely fascinating. I know I did. It's a very, very interesting story. But before we get started, make sure you subscribe to my channel, because I'll be over the moon if you do, and I think you will also, because you'll get so many amazing stories to listen to. And who doesn't need a good story before you go to bed? It's the best thing that you could ever do, is listen to a good story. Nothing beats that. So let's get started. The Kushtaka. Dear Sarah, I'm writing to you to share with you my real-life monster story that happened where I live in Juneau in Alaska. I live in a world of magnificent beauty consisting of mountains, lake and tundra. I figured your listeners would be intrigued to hear my story, whether they believe it or not. I have to admit I would not blame your listeners if they did not believe me, because all these years later, I still sometimes wonder if it all was just a terrible dream. I figured your listeners have got to be more open-minded than the average person in the population because they believe in Bigfoot. And like them, I do too. I live in the Alaska Triangle, considered to be the Bermuda Triangle of the North, only it's far more deadly. It is also often known as the Devil's Graveyard and consists of Juneau, Yakutat, Anchorage and Barrow, otherwise known as Zone 10. So many conspiracy theories abound about the aeroplanes and people that literally vanish off the face of the earth, never to be found again. Here in the Alaskan Triangle, 500 to 1,000 of these people vanish every year. Imagine that. As you can imagine, local legends are rife as to the true culprit of all these disappearances, which are often put down to strange green men, skinwalkers, aliens, Bigfoots, and the Kushtaka, otherwise known as Otter Man. Others believe that the ley lines in Alaska can cause people to hallucinate, so they get lost or even eaten. My belief is that Bigfoot and Otter Man have a lot to do with the missing people that disappear every year in Alaska. I believe this emphatically because I had a personal experience with the Otter Man that will give your listeners goosebumps because it is so chilling. The Otter Man is said to be 600 pounds and is half otter and half man. He is known as the Kushtaka, and I promise you he is as real as Bigfoot. There is something supernatural about this creature, as he is said to be able to shapeshift. When I was growing up, my grandmother told me a true story about the Kushtaka. She said that a young girl and boy were playing by Lake Aukrey in Juneau when the little girl started to cry because she saw her favourite doll floating in the water. She went to grab her doll, and the next thing she knew was this huge humanoid creature that looked like a gargantuan otter covered with dense, smooth brown hair, pulled the young girl under the water, and she was never to be seen again. The boy recounted the story to his mother, and there was no sign of that plastic doll that he swore he had seen in the water. The boy was so sad about his sister's disappearance that the next day, without his parents knowing, he went to look for his sister and was seen by a bystander going into the water. He was also never seen again. My bet is that he saw an image of his sister struggling in the water and he went to rescue her. You see that the Otter Man knows how to play games with your mind, and he can shapeshift into anything. My grandmother warned me to be careful about any lake in the Alaskan Triangle. I never took her that seriously, as the story she told me seemed way too far-fetched until it happened to me exactly how my grandmother had described. It was in the summer of 1982, and I was walking around Lake Aukrey, and I suddenly saw my cat Misty fighting for her life in the water. Misty had been missing for 6 whole months, and now she was there in this lake. It seemed like a miracle to me, and I immediately ran to her aid. The next thing I knew was that these two large hairy arms pulled me under the water. I opened my eyes to see this huge mammoth otter, humanoid-like creature holding me down with a brute force. I have been a free diver for many years, and so I have learned to hold my breath under the water for a very long time, and that is what I did. I did this while I fought off this creature with all my might, but he was way too strong for me. The next thing I knew was that 2 very strong Alaskan locals were pulling me out of the water. "We saw you trying to save your cat," they told me, "and then something pulled you down." I knew I was lucky to be alive, and I also knew that the Misty I had seen in the water was not my cat at all that had gone missing. The one thing that amazes me about the Otter Man is that he is able to exploit our weaknesses. He knew that I would go in the water to save my cat. Yet how did he even know about Misty? How did he know about the little girl's doll? All I can say is this creature is a master of deceptive depravity, and he has supernatural powers, even though he is as physically real as you and I. In Alaska, there are many crazy, unexplainable stories from this part of the world. Many may be of interest to your listeners, and I can get people here in Alaska to send you some of their weird and wonderful stories, and I will. As for Bigfoot, I know he's real. I have never seen him myself, but I know of many people who have interesting tales to send you about the hairy man, and you want to hear them, you really do. Hello, good evening to you. Welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so delighted that you've joined me this evening. It's going to be such a lovely story, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. And it definitely gives you the question, well, is there something supernatural about Bigfoot? And in this story, we hear about a Bigfoot that actually is seen around a fire. Now, I have heard few stories of Bigfoots and fire, which really does make you think how incredibly intelligent this animal clearly is if he is able to make fire. So let's get started. I think you're going to enjoy this story. And before we go any further, let me remind you that if you haven't subscribed, please do so. I'll be so glad if you do. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Sally Ann, and my Bigfoot encounter happened 10 years ago when I was 15 years old. I grew up as a single child in a very wealthy home where I never wanted for anything, and life seemed incredibly good. My parents lived on a luxury estate on Lake Oswego in Oregon, and for the first 12 years I had such a loving home life. My mother and I were incredibly close, so when she sadly died from colon cancer on December the 12th, 2008, my heart was well and truly broken. My dad did not cope with my mother's death at all well. He would shut himself in his office or retire to bed early, and I was left alone with our Latino housekeeper, who was the only spark in my sad little life. Even though I had everything, I would have given it all up in a heartbeat to have my beautiful mother back. I began to hate and despise our beautiful home because it was a haunting reminder of happier times I had spent with her. And suddenly our large home was like a noose around my neck. I had friends, of course, rich ones, who wanted to indulge themselves at lavish social events, while I just withdrew from the world like a tortoise in a shell, and subsequently had very little to do with them. Sometimes I would stand in our huge, beautiful kitchen, and you could have heard a pin drop. My home had become so deadly quiet that even a mortuary may have had more life than our home did. One day, when my dad was a little more like his old self again, he told me that he was getting remarried. The moment I met my stepmother, I knew she was a budding social climber that was marrying my dad for money and not for love. I even told him that I could see through her, and my dad reminded me of how lonely he had become. He told me that wife number 2 did not measure up to my mother, but he said he just could not bear the agony of being alone for a moment longer, and this lady surely had some lovable qualities. Clearly, I didn't see them. I did not like anything about Nikki, and I promise you she did not like me. The feeling was neutral. I was not even a bridesmaid at their wedding because Nikki insisted she only wanted little flower girls walking down the aisle with her, and I knew it was because she just did not want me to be her bridesmaid. Once my father was married to Nikki, she showed her true colours, and believe me, they were dark. This woman was so hostile to me, and if I said anything back to her or stood up for myself, then I wasn't even allowed to eat anything. On several occasions, she would lock me up in my room without explanation, and one day I caught her having intimacy with our gardener, who was a very handsome young man. As time went by, she became nastier and nastier towards me, and the verbal abuse was insane. I do not even wish to put those insults to paper. I don't want to give them the light of day. I have a tough skin, so I could take on more than the average person. But one day, enough was enough, and I had to get away from that evil woman. You would think as a rich girl I would have access to my dad's funds like most rich girls do. Not me. Nikki had frozen my bank accounts and confiscated my pocket money, and my father had agreed to all this because she told him all kinds of lies about me. Your daughter needs some tough lessons, she told him. She's a spoiled, self-centered brat. In front of my father, Nicky was a different woman and treated me sweetly. But once his back was turned, out came her pitchfork and her snake-like tongue. Only our Latino housekeeper, who was at the receiving end of her abuse as well, knew how terrible Nicky really was. And my father was also just a victim, as we all were, and she had him under her witch-like thumb. I decided I was going to run away, but I had nowhere to go. I did not have friends to stay with, because after my mother died, I withdrew from all those friendships. I decided that I would go and camp in a nearby area of national forest that I knew well from the past. I knew that it would be the perfect hideaway, and so I got all the camping gear together, like sleeping bags, tents, torches, pot, fire starters, fishing rod, and I rifled through the pantry for all our tinned food, and I stuffed everything in a backpack and left the house just like that. I had enough money to get a taxi ride to the forest, which had hiking trails for walkers and even areas where there are man-made fire pits. I made sure I veered away from all those trails because I wanted to find a remote spot away from prying eyes. For the first week of camping, I can honestly say that I have never felt more alive in my entire life. I knew how to fish and had successfully caught some big fish without much trouble, and so I knew that come what may, I wasn't going to starve. I had come familiar with the wildlife, and being close to nature was very therapeutic for me. I was even having dreams about my mother that just brought me so much peace and comfort. One night I saw a crackling fire very close to my campsite, which was weird because people did not tend to camp in the most remote spots unless they were extremely adventurous. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided I would go and take a peek to see who this person was. It was relatively dark, but there was a little moonlight filtering through the trees, and armed with my torch, which I avoided using as much as possible unless it was necessary, I crept up close to the camp. I was surprised to see there was no tent up, nor was there a hammock, but sitting by this fire was the hugest creature I have ever seen in my entire life. When I say huge, I mean huge. We're talking about a creature who's sitting on the ground. His torso is about 4.5 feet off the ground. So imagine how massive this thing would be if he was to stand up on 2 legs. The creature had a distinct bullet-shaped head, and he had an ape-like face. But something about his face and body were human, although I cannot really say what. His whole body was covered in black hair, apart from his face. I watched him staring into the fire just like a human would. And what amazed me is about this creature, whatever it was, it had known how to make that fire. What animal on this earth knows how to do that? I was amazed. I'd never seen an animal like this before, and I think my awe and shock at what I was seeing took away any fear. I should have been deathly afraid of this formidable creature, but all I could do was just stare and stare in awe. What the heck was this animal, I wondered. The creature swatted away some mosquitoes that were irritating him, and then he turned around and looked at me. Our eyes met, and for a moment, frozen in time, I felt a bizarre connection with him. Maybe both of us understood the meaning of being truly alone, or maybe this creature had a family, and I wondered about that. Isn't it odd I'm facing an enormous predator and wondering about his family? I know it sounds super crazy, but it felt as if the creature was reading my mind. He looked at me with a keen interest and a curiosity. What was weirder still was he did not seem at all surprised to see me. It was almost like the meeting had been preordained, almost as if he had been expecting my visit. I moved forward and stood by the fire, and we both stared at the flames for a long time. Finally, I gathered my senses together and walked away, and the creature watched me as I left, and I could swear I saw him nod. When I got back to my campsite, I felt so elated and uplifted, I can't explain it. I felt like I had been so privileged to meet this wizened creature, whatever he was. And I knew that this was a creature that had never been recorded by science. That night as I slept, I saw my mother, in a floating white dress, holding the huge hand of this creature that I had seen earlier by the fire. The creature spoke to me in the dream, "Go back home, your father needs you." I woke up from the dream startled. It had seemed so vivid and so real. I felt certain that I needed to listen to the creature. I felt as if he had spoken to me through my subconscious mind. The next day I returned home with the help of some kindly people on the trail who allowed me to phone my dad on their cell phone. When I did get home, I rushed into the arms of my dad, and we both just sobbed and sobbed. My father said the moment that I had left, he just knew it was because of Nikki, and even the housekeeper had confided in him how dreadful Nikki had been towards me. "I told her to leave immediately," he said, "and I'm filing for divorce." The house, for the first time in ages, began to feel like the home I had once loved. My father told me that he had a bizarre dream the night before I returned. "I saw your mother in a floating white dress, and there was this giant hairy ape with her, and he was holding her hand, and he looked at me and said, 'Sally Ann is coming home. Keep strong.'" I had never believed in the supernatural, but everything seemed so weird to me because events flowed in such an extraordinary way that I began to wonder that whether there was something outer-worldly about the encounter with the hairy man that I know now to be a Bigfoot. I hope you enjoyed my story. P.S. I'm sure your listeners would like to know that my father is now married again to an amazing woman called Molly, who reminds me so much of my late mother. My father is smitten by her and I adore her. She's a second mother to me. Hello, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening. I've got such a lovely story for you where we get a bit of divine justice against rape that is taking place because Bigfoot steps on the scene to save the day. And it's a story I just love, and I know you're going to love it too. And so let's get started. But before we do, make sure you subscribe to the channel because I've got so many more wonderful stories for you to listen to, and you don't want to miss out. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Marilyn, and my story happened in the late 1980s when I was doing a 4-year undergraduate major at a liberal arts college. Now, I will not be giving you names or places for obvious reasons, but I will tell you this: it was somewhere in North America. One day it was all over the college that there was a young student who had been raped and murdered and found at the edge of the wooded area on the college grounds. The students liked to use this route by way of a shortcut to access a shopping area on the other side of the woods. It was a real bummer, and we were advised that when we accessed this area, we should never be on our own. I remember the police interviewing everybody on campus. Had we seen or heard anything? Did we know anything or anyone who was dating the girl in question, and so forth? The questions went on and on. After a while, the case died down until suddenly the rapist was in business again. There were 5 more girls murdered and raped, and whoever the perpetrator was, he was getting bold and very sure of himself in his actions. He had killed and raped one girl in the female toilets, another one in a back alley in the campus, and the other 3 were on the campus grounds in close proximity to the pool where he had flung their bodies after he had killed them. The rapist did seem to have a type that he pursued, as all the girls he raped were blonde, they were slim and fair. Everyone at college was absolutely terrified. All the women were looking over their shoulders, wondering if the rapist was in their midst. I remember the blonde girls all dyeing their hair in the hope of turning their would-be pursuer in another direction. The girls tended to stick together, and there was a very real fear of even accepting a date from a boy. So times were tough for us, and we had to stick together, and we did, until the police found the perpetrator to this terrible crime. For the first time in my life, I was grateful to be a plain Jane, and not eye candy for the boys to feast on. For once in my life, I was glad I did not look like an aspiring model, and I did feel confident that the rapist would not be pursuing me. A police profiler came to the college to talk to the students. He said that they had drawn up what they believed was an accurate profile of the rapist. They described him as a loner who enjoyed outdoor pursuits, especially hunting. He had probably been abusive towards animals all his life, and possibly killed them in sadistic ways for sheer pleasure. He would have an intense hatred for women. This, the profile believed, stemmed from a mother who he believed was a slim woman with blonde hair who may have been a model in her youth, and for some reason he hated her. He went on to say that the rapist felt very inadequate as far as women were concerned and had never had a girlfriend, but she believed he had visited ladies of the night regularly and was rarely a sadomasochist. The profiler believed that this guy was thin and scrawny and not very good looking or attractive. He had been cut off from his home by his mother and was supporting himself with manual jobs. He was antisocial, evasive, and emotionally immature. Nobody had any clue who this bloke was, but there was a marked increase in the dating game again, although the girls would only go for good-looking, muscular types who did not fit the profile. I knew one girl very well who I believed was the perfect type for the rapist. I will call her Sue so as to keep her details confidential. Anyway, unlike the other blonde girls who fit the rapist's credentials, Sue flaunted her blonde hair and her slim body, as if she was waiting to become the next Playboy bunny. I seriously worried about her because she was a nice girl really, but her naivety was off the charts. While other girls were covering up their assets, Sue was showing them off and making sure that every boy in college had the hots for her. She tottered around like a dolly bird with short skirts, low-cut blouses and tons of makeup done to perfection. One day I was staring outside the college window, just quite by accident, and I suddenly noticed Sue taking a shortcut through the wooded area that we were strictly told not to go through without another person with us. It was out of bounds for anybody who was walking on their own. I imagined she was going to meet a boy, but on this day she was dressed like a real floozy, if ever I saw one. As I watched her tottering into the woods, I caught a glimpse of a thin man following her, and my heart sank. I had visions of Sue being another rape victim or statistic. I was certain that this guy, whoever he was, potentially could be the rapist the police were looking for. Hastily, I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, out of the campus grounds, into the wooded area, and sure enough, I could hear screaming. And it was poor Sue, and she was begging and begging for her life. I stood behind the tree watching the scene unfold, and I realized suddenly how defenseless I was. The rapist could also take me down and even kill me if I intervened. I saw him pulling down Sue's skirts, and she was struggling and kicking her legs violently, but she was no match for the skinny guy, who clearly was incredibly strong. Suddenly I heard the loudest guttural growl I have ever heard, and it was the most terrifying sound. And it was so startling that even the rapist loosened his hold on Sue for a moment in his horror. And Sue didn't waste any time. She took this opportunity to flee from the scene and run back to the college as fast as she could. Then I saw him. I have never in all my born days seen a creature as imposing and as terrifying. I could feel my own fear observing this monstrous creature that looked like he had come from an age when monsters roamed the earth. The thing, whatever it was, stood on two humongous legs with a stature of 10 feet tall and possibly 8 feet across. He was gargantuan, and his body was covered with thick black hair. He had long arms and human-like hands and feet, and his face looked like that of a great, magnificent ape. He had a humanness about him, but he was not human, and an ape-like quality to him, but he was not an ape. I could see the creature's brown eyes were furious, and the rage he expressed was palpable. I have no idea if he had seen the attempted rape of Sue with his own eyes, but I imagined he may have. Could this be the cause of his fury, or was he just being territorial? I was not sure, but never have I witnessed such anger in my whole life. This creature flung the rapist in the air, catching him before he fell so as to prolong the agony. The guy was screaming, "Help, help!" But the creature continued to fling him up in the air, terrorizing the man again and again and again. And after he'd had his fun, he then literally pulled off one of the man's legs and threw it across the forest floor, and then he tore off an arm and did exactly the same. The rapist was still alive in those moments, and the look on his face was one of complete and utter terror. And when he saw his leg lying near to him, he screamed. Suddenly the life ebbed away from him, and he lay there limp, and I knew that he was dead. Even though his life was ceased, the creature kept slamming the body of the man against the tree until it really became just a pile of blood, fat, and goo. And even the head was crushed into the ground like a large ostrich egg. The creature's anger subsided, and just when the police came running in the woods to apprehend the culprit, they were stunned by the pile of goo that awaited them on the forest floor. By then, the creature had long since exited the scene, as quickly as he had come. I took this opportunity to slip away. There was absolutely no need to talk to the police, and I doubt they would have ever believed my story about the strange creature that I saw, which I now know to be the hairy man, Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I knew justice had been done to that nasty rapist, and Sue was free to dress as inappropriately as she liked. So all was well for the college again. I never even told Sue that the Bigfoot actually saved her life. She never even knew about the Bigfoot. What would have been the point anyway? Sue did change after her experience. She dyed her hair black and dressed in modest clothes, and through the rest of college, I never saw her flirt with anyone, not once. As for the guy who tried to rape Sue, and thankfully never succeeded, the criminal profiles assessment of this chap was spot on in every single way. It was utterly extraordinary how accurate it was. One day I did get a picture of the rapist's mother in the paper, and I kid you not, she looked exactly like the woman he had raped. All those women he had raped looked just like his mother. My theory is that he hated his mother so very much, and the only way to get back at her and to extract revenge was by attacking women that looked exactly like her, and that is clearly what he did. I hope you found my story of interest. It is the first time I've ever shared it. Thank you so much for that amazing story, and I'm so glad justice was done, because nobody deserves to be raped. Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I know you're going to really enjoy this story tonight. I particularly love it. It's a story about Bigfoot being sick, and this young girl actually looked after him. And it's an amazing story, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So let's get started. But before we do, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because I've got amazing stories out there. And who doesn't need a good story? Let's get started. Dear Sarah, hello Sarah, and all your listeners. I literally cannot wait to tell you my Bigfoot story, because it is something I have never personally shared with anyone, apart from my husband, of course, who 100% believes my account of the day because he knows I'm not given to telling lies. I currently work in law, and so I do appreciate your discretion in keeping my name out of the story. I will be making up my name to protect myself and others in the story, so let's just pretend my name is Lily. Anyway, my story happened in the 80s. Seems like a whole world away now. I loved growing up in the 80s. It was a good time to be young. When I was 13 years old, my father and mother decided to go abroad. They were to visit relatives in Ireland, reunite with friends in England, and then they were all going together on a safari in the Serengeti Game Reserve in Kenya. In the 80s, going abroad was a big deal, not like it is now. They were all incredibly excited, but the question was what to do with me. Was I to come along? No was the answer. I still needed to go to school. It was decided that I would go and stay on my uncle's farm in Colorado. I was very excited because my uncle's farm was amazing and incredibly beautiful, and there were acres upon acres of untouched land to explore. Who would not be thrilled? It was decided that my uncle's wife Claire would homeschool me while my parents were away. I still remember the day I arrived at the farm and was introduced to Sinbad, the beautiful cinnamon horse with a black mane and long black tail. We both just connected immediately, and I would spend countless hours with him after schoolwork, washing him down with a hose, shampooing him and grooming him. Every time I had free time, Sinbad and I would go riding all over my uncle's farm. We had so much fun together, and I could tell Sinbad was really warming to me. We had a great connection. I'd always loved animals all my life, and I'd been known to nurse so many animals back to health. In Houston, where my parents lived, or still live, I have saved the odd bird that had fallen out of its nest too soon, and rescued kittens that were halfway drowned and fed them with a syringe until they were old enough to eat solids. The vet would call me the miracle worker and would always ask me to nurse any sick animal that came into his surgery if I was willing to. Yes, you've guessed it, I never ever said no, not once, because I've always loved animals and always will. I still rescue animals today, sometimes on a larger scale, like bear cubs who lost their mother, or even a mountain lion cub. I've done it all, believe me. They say that animals sense your nature, and I think it's true, because even my friends over the years who had dogs that were reluctant to greet strangers, their dogs were never insecure around me, and it was always commented about. Why do my dogs love me so much, Lily, they would say. Anyway, back to my story. Let us just talk about the day that I met the hairy monster that people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It was a beautiful sunny day. I remember it as clearly as if it was yesterday. The sun was warming my back as Sinbad and I trotted across the valley and past fields of sage into the thicker areas of forest where there was a lot of dry fall. On this particular day, I noticed that Sinbad was not being himself. He just refused to move forward anymore, and I tried to encourage him to walk forwards, but he just wouldn't. In fact, his ears went back, and he got back on his hind legs in a defensive pose and returned around and bolted off. Now, Sinbad had never run off on me. I was now standing in a thicker area of brush with more trees quite a way away from the farmhouse. I looked around to see what had scared my horse so badly. Was it a rattlesnake, or could it have been a bear or some kind of feline cat wandering around? I was not sure, nor was I afraid. I just had a strange feeling come over me that something needed my help. Every time I had stumbled across a stray animal needing my help in the past, I had instinctively started to look for it as if something was guiding me to help it. On this occasion, that very same feeling overcame me. I started surveying the area, looking for something that was abandoned by its mother or had become hurt in some way. I was expecting to find something small hiding in the grass, but I was about to find something that I would have never imagined in my wildest nightmares. Yes, you guessed it. I found Bigfoot. I heard this low moaning sound. It was a guttural, throaty sound, but it was much more like a whimpering sound rather than a growl. It was the sound I would identify as agonizing pain. Then I found the creature. It was lying inside an abandoned and rusting trailer, and it had completely covered itself with grass and twigs and branches. The first thing I noticed when I approached it was the most revolting sulfur-like smell that you get from someone who's been farting a lot, only much, much worse than that. I could also smell feces and urine. The creature was covered with grass so much that I could not make it out at all. It was probably for that reason that I approached it boldly. I could see how scared and terrified their eyes were as they looked at me. It looked incredibly vulnerable. For a moment I mistook this creature for a bear cub because it was not that big. But when I brushed the grass off its body, I got the shock of my life. I was looking at a creature of about 4 foot in height, but its proportions were very big. I guessed he was still a youngster, but I'd never seen anything like him before. I did wonder where his parents were and why it seemed that he had been abandoned. What was he, I thought? I'd never seen anything like him before. He was definitely not human, and yet there was a humanity to his features, if you know what I mean. I noticed that there were feces sticking to the animal's coat as well as pieces of vomit. The animal groaned and held his stomach really tightly and winced. He also started to retch, and the most horrible greenish vomit came out of his mouth. He no longer seemed afraid. I think he could sense I wanted to help him, and I certainly did. I knew he was communicating with me and telling me his stomach hurt. He might have food poisoning, I thought, maybe a viral infection or possibly just a normal infection, I wasn't sure. I knew a little bit about veterinary medicine, having worked with a vet on several occasions. I knew antibiotics were great, but they didn't work on viruses, and I knew that with food poisoning, animals were often given charcoal to absorb the poison. I was not sure what was wrong with this creature, yet I knew I could not tell my uncle about him, especially because he was an unknown species, and I wanted to help this animal on my own. I spoke to him in a gentle, reassuring voice and even tried to wipe some of the feces and vomit off his fur. He did not seem to mind me touching him. On the contrary, my touch was so comforting and reassuring to him, and I noticed that he did start to make gentle grunting sounds that to me sounded like gestures of appreciation. Another thing I noticed about the animals was that he was extremely gaunt, and that worried me very much. There was no fat on his body, despite his chunky size. His bones were literally showing through the skin, like those half-starved dogs that you sometimes see on TV. I tried to act by going in and out of the trailer, making gestures to try and explain that I was coming back. He just looked at me with these big, round, scared eyes. I started to walk home because Sinbad appeared to have abandoned me. But I was wrong. Even though he had kept himself far away from the creature, he was waiting for me in a nearby field and came trotting up to me with his mouth chewing a bunch of delicious-looking grasses. I was so happy to see him because it meant getting back to the farm sooner. As my uncle farmed all kinds of animals, he had various kinds of antibiotics for animals and stuff like that. So I raided his medical supplies, looking for something that might help this animal. I found some antibiotics, some charcoal tablets, and something marked antiviral. I know I was being naughty and taking a risk, but I only cared about this poor animal. I even looked into our medicine cabinet for anti-inflammatories and stomach calms. Do not judge me too severely, because remember, I was very young at the time. The next day I returned to the creature and gave him a dose of charcoal tablets and gestured for him to drink them down. He watched me as I demonstrated the protocol and was intelligent enough to copy me. He did the same with the antivirals and antibiotics. I then tried to give him some bananas and a slice of toast that I had brought from home, along with a piece of boiled chicken and rice. I also brought him a couple of cans of Coca-Cola because I knew that was good for a bad tummy. Sadly, he showed absolutely no interest. He did not touch the food and winced again, clutching his stomach in agony. The next 2 days that followed the animal seemed to be getting worse, not better, and I was growing increasingly concerned. Maybe the medications were killing him, I thought in horror. The next day I made my way back to the Bigfoot creature and was expecting him to be worse than ever. I had made the decision that if he was not any better, I was going to have to involve my uncle and ask for his intervention, and I was not sure how he was going to react to this creature, and it could be unfavourable, I thought. Luckily, on this day, the Bigfoot was chattering away happily. I could see he had no energy because he was undernourished, but I noticed he had drunk all the Coca-Cola, eaten the bananas and chicken. I was so happy because I could see he was well on the way to getting better. I nursed the Bigfoot for several days after that, bringing him bananas, Cokes and chicken. He really loved that Coca-Cola. I've never seen anything drink as much Coke as he did. When I went back to see my Bigfoot friend, he had gone. There was no sign of him at all. I felt really sad that he had gone. I almost felt a loss, but I also felt happy because I knew he'd recovered from whatever had made him sick. So that was a huge relief. The next couple of months were uneventful at my uncle's farm, but I had so much fun playing in the fields and riding Sinbad. Then on one autumn day, Sinbad started playing up again. His ears went back and he bolted, leaving me standing alone in the field. I looked across towards the bank, which was covered with thick trees, but as there was a great deal of tree fall, I could see the outline of 3 dark, shadowy figures in the clearing. I moved forward, standing about 30 yards away from the creatures. I could see 2 massive creatures. One was clearly a female because she had breast, and the other was at least 2 feet taller than her. I think he was about 10 foot tall, and his chest area was enormous at 4 foot wide. He had very leathery, crinkly face with whiskers like an old man. He was also covered with grey hair that was almost turning white. His eyes looked at me with a keen interest, much like we would look at an unusual species at the zoo. I did feel like I was being studied, but I didn't mind. The female was younger and very slender, although strong and big. I would say she was about 7 feet tall, and her expression looked somber and also contemplative. but the female was a tawny brown colour, and she was about 7 foot tall and about 3 feet wide across the chest. It was then that I saw the Bigfoot that I had nursed and called Coco, based on his love for Coca-Cola. I knew he recognized me because he was chattering excitedly to his parents. Nothing was said by any of us as we all locked eyes and stared at each other. It was like a non-verbal communication, and I really believe they were thanking me. To this day, I do not know why I was not afraid. It was only years later that I discovered that this strange creature was a Bigfoot that many people are terrified of today. My uncle sadly passed away 20 years ago, but I do remember him mentioning once that his little Yorkshire Terrier just vanished one night, and they could not find him anywhere. They went out on a search party and called his name, and there was no response. He then told us that they woke up the following morning to find little Rufus on the bed, sleeping peacefully, although he did smell really horrible. He proceeded to tell me, "I do not know how that dog got in. There was only one open window that was 8 feet tall. How the heck could he have got through that? I will never know." I smiled to myself. Maybe Bigfoot was returning the favor, I thought, and I smiled. Well, that's the end of my story. I hope your listeners enjoyed it and are not too judgmental about me helping the hairy monster. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.